Hello everybody and welcome to this instalment in the NCTJ Summer School series. Today's topic is how to tell a news story. Now, my name is Emma Robinson and I am the Accreditation Manager at the NCTJ. Before joining the NCTJ, I worked as a reporter at NewsQuest Essex and I myself studied on an NCTJ accredited course. I achieved the Gold Standard Diploma, and while I was working in the industry, I then gained the senior level qualification, now known as the NQJ. So, after you find your news story, you interview the relevant people and take down the notes and quotes. It's really important to then learn the skills to be able to report the story accurately and legally sound, ready to be published. So, news stories often abide by set rules for framing an introduction, structuring the story, and using quotes. So in today's session, we'll run through how to write an introduction with impact, including what to do and what not to do, how to effectively structure your story, how to use quotes in your story, and how writing for the web changes how you write the story as well. So first things first, we're going to talk through how to write an introduction with impact and what to do first of all. So the first tip is to keep the introduction brief and to the point. Stick to one idea. If you've written more than 30 words, then I'd consider rewriting the introduction. And think about how you would tell the story to your friends. You'd want to get across the most important piece of information first. So, for example, if a lorry driver has crashed into a school bus and the lorry driver has died, then there's plenty of important parts to this story, but you want to start off with telling your friends and starting the story with the lorry driver has died after a crash with the school bus, and then mentioning, traffic tailbacks, diversions, disruption to the school day, that sort of thing. You want to choose strong words that will have an impact and grip the reader's attention. For example, crash, smash, rather than using the words collided or collision. Avoid jargon, for example. Emergency services like to use phrases like RTC or road traffic collision, but it's your job as a journalist to simplify this jargon, cut it out, and use words that everybody uses in every day, such as crash. And that's the word that people will be Googling as well, remember. So, as I said earlier, stick to one idea for the introduction. Stick to, lorry driver dies in crash with school bus, or lorry driver dies and children injured in crash with school bus. You don't want to be adding any more detail in at this stage about where it's happened, when, how bad the traffic is, etc. That can come later down in your story. But if new information comes in, such as you find out the driver's name or you get tributes to that driver, for example, then the intro can be changed. Or you write a follow-up story, for example, tributes pour in for lorry driver killed in horror smash with school bus. And another tip as well is to use an active voice for the introduction and the entire news story, so the subject of the sentence is always performing the action. Now to what to avoid in an introduction. So I would suggest avoiding using quotes in an intro, because they rarely work, and they only really work if the reader really cares about who the person is who's speaking. For example, if it's the Prime Minister rather than a spokesman for the local gardeners club, for example. Now, when you want to report what people are saying in the introduction, remember to keep the sentence active. For example, the Prime Minister said, we should no longer trade with America. Don't use the quote, paraphrase it, and then support it with a quote in the next line. Now, delayed introductions, drop introductions, or narrative style of introduction should normally be reserved for features, then they shouldn't be used for news stories. You don't want to keep the reader waiting for the most important part of the information. You want to give them that compelling information first so that they read on in your story. Now, next up is the structure of your story. Once you've captured the reader's attention in the first paragraph, you need to think about then how to structure the story going forward. The next 2 or 3 paragraphs really should be about developing the introduction, adding information, and even summarising the whole story. And then you introduce a quote to give more colour to the story. As I said, the quote should be used for someone to express an opinion or a view, or to give a lively account of something that's happened. Use colourful, emotive language in your quote. This is why it's so important to ask the right questions at the interview to get that colour and to get that strong opinion. You don't want to use a quote to give routine, run-of-the-mill information or to just say what you've already said in the story. The quote should amplify what you've already written. So the basic structure of the news story is to think about an inverted triangle. Important stuff goes at the top of your story, and then the least important stuff at the bottom. And that's because the reader's attention wavers and they may stop reading as they go through the story and before they reach the end of the story, for example. So after you've written your intro, the next part should be devoted to amplifying what's been said in that introduction, adding more explanation and important information to let the reader know what's happened. Then it's key to add in quotes, more colour and more detail, and then at the end of the story, put information that's interesting but perhaps not vital to the reader's understanding of the story. Now if we move on to handling quotes, it's a good rule to tell the reader who is speaking before we launch into that quote. It lets the reader evaluate the value of the speaker and the worth of what they say. So it's preferable to use the format, Emma Robinson said, with a colon and quotation marks around the quotes, rather than, starting with a quote and then saying, said Emma Robinson. And if it's a partial quote, then the quotation marks go only around the quoted speech and before the full stop in the sentence as well. As I said, the rule with quotes is to use the good ones that add dynamics and might inform the reader about the speaker's mood or character. If you want to add other parts of what the interviewee said to help explain the story, but perhaps they don't need to be included in full quotes as they aren't strong enough or emotive enough, then perhaps use reported speech, and this goes in the past tense. So for example, Emma Robinson, a witness at the scene, said there was an oil spillage which could cause disturbance to the wildlife. So that doesn't need to be written in a direct quote. Now next we're moving on to how does writing for the web change how you write your story. Now writing for the web is different to writing a news article for a newspaper, and that is all down to search engine optimization, or SEO. SEO is all about writing in a way that brings your story to the top of rankings on an internet search engine such as Google. This is put very simply though, because there is much more to SEO just than that. Traditionally, newspaper news stories avoided putting the name of the village, town, city, for example, high up in the story, because if you're reading the newspaper, that's where you're reading about. And if you're going to be putting the village, town, city high up in the story on the headline, it had to be big or central to the news story. Whereas SEO suggests that you use that location because it's a search term that people may use, and likewise with people's names. So the more famous, nationally or locally, leads you to putting that name in the introduction, whereas traditionally you wouldn't normally put the name in the introduction. So for SEO, it's important to use relevant keywords in your story. For example, names of places, people, companies, and events. And headlines are very important. Use nouns such as the town or the village. And I think a key thing as well is don't use puns or metaphors or clever wordplay for online stories. They're often the meat and drink for newspapers, but you need to be thinking about the words that people will search for. It might be tempting to describe a huge fire as an inferno, and that would work really well for a newspaper article, but people will be searching on Google for a fire. The same goes for a crash. You need to write it as a crash for SEO rather than horror smash. It's also worth researching the keywords that people use to get to your news site, and research what keywords your competitors may be targeting too, to ensure that you're reaching your target audience who are interested in the news that you are putting out. And think about your formatting when you're writing for the web. Online readers have different preferences and habits to those who consume printed media. They tend to want content in smaller, digestible chunks. So think about this when you're writing your online stories. Typically, you will need shorter sentences, bullet points, subheadings, so that you can direct them quickly to the information that they're looking for. So I hope this has helped. In summary, the essence of a good news story is simplicity and economy. Choose a simple and correct word. If it can be written in one word, there's no need to write it in 5 words. Stick to the point to make it clear and easy for the reader. Write it like you would say it as well. We're all pretty good at getting our point across quickly in speech, but we tend to use more complicated sentences and bury the most important point under a lot of detail when we're writing. So there's no room for lengthy, languid sentences in a news story. Now, thank you all for listening, and keep a lookout for our summer school videos on media law and ethics to ensure that your copy is legally and ethically sound. Thank you.